Yo, what's up guys, Alf here, and today I'm going to be doing a video, basically just a rant about the BNR, specifically for Historic, because I think this has been the most disappointed I've ever been with a BNR, and a lot about this is really concerning to me, as someone who basically plays Historic as their main format, what I think of the format going forwards, why I think they maybe didn't hit Sorin, which is going to be the main topic of this video, why I think it's a very big problem that they didn't, and what the format's going to be looking at going forward. So anyway, let's just get straight into it. So if you missed it, the BNR came out on Monday, and obviously last weekend we had the Historic Qualifier. Now, Historic as a format, especially as someone who curates a tier list and, you know, talks about the format pretty regularly, it's difficult to get a true understanding of the metagame because ladder is kind of the only real way we have of playing until these qualifiers come around. And you know, obviously a lot of players do try and tune the best lists for ladder, but a lot of people try and experiment. I think Historic is a really good format for brewers, so you are going to face a lot of stuff that isn't just the completely refined top tier stuff. But when these Historic qualifiers come around, you know, a lot of the pro players come in, we get a lot of people, you know, really good brewers, really good players testing the format, and then obviously for these events, everyone's just going to be trying to find the best deck, and it's way easier to get a true understanding of the current metagame. And now that the dust is settled, in my mind, the clear two tier 1 decks to me right now are Sorin and Energy. Now obviously Sorin has a lot of different variants. You got Orzhov, Abzan, Jund, Golgari, Esper, but we're specifically talking about Sorin itself here, Sorin plus Elender. So we are talking about all of those decks together. And, you know, even though there are different variants, you know, if I was going to do a quick tier list of the variants within Sorin, I'd probably say Orzhov and Abzan are the best. You know, I think Orzhov had the better results in the qualifier, but I personally prefer Abzan. I think they're very similar builds anyway, a lot of the time. Then below that, I'd probably have Jund and Golgari, and then below that I'd probably have Esper, but I consider them all tier 1. Maybe Esper not quite so, but you know, Sorin decks are quite clearly the best decks in the format. The fact it's, you know, a 2-card combo that requires basically no previous board setup that you can do on turn 3 just with 2 cards in your hand is very powerful, because then it leaves loads of room in the rest of the deck for tons of interaction, which means all the Sorin decks are running Thoughtseize Fatal Push, which makes it really difficult to attack from any angle really. So that's why Sorin is a real issue. And in the last qualifier, I compiled all the lists that I could find either from Discord or Twitter. You know, Fire Shoes was a big one. Always shouts out to Fire Shoes. And out of the 10 decks that I saw that qualified for the Arena Championship, there was 1 Energy, 1 Eldrazi, 1 Rona, and 7 Sorin variants. Yeah, I sent this tweet out the day of the BNR. And this alone is a massive red flag to me. 70% of the decks making it through were Sorin. Now, if this was, you know, kind of a thing where a team like Handshake, for example, had kind of found Sorin and no one else had, they kind of broken it and got 7 players through, then that alone would be a concern, right? That would still require action on either Sorin or Elender, because 70% is ridiculous. But if it was an unknown deck, there's always a chance that the meta can correct, and, you know, maybe the format can settle with Sorin as a part of it. But the really concerning thing was that Sorin has been the known best deck going into this event for months, to the point where people are brewing decks specifically to beat Sorin. I think the last premium article I put out before the qualifier went live was a variety of different decks that I'd been testing that were main decking for Containment Priest, which is, you know, the fact that that's even a thought for me is a sign of how dominant Sorin was. So the fact that Sorin was the known best deck going into this qualifier, people knew about it, people were targeting it with decks like Azorius Flash and stuff like that, and it's still beating those decks, and it's still got 70%. I think this is the most dominance I've ever seen from a combo in any qualifier, let alone a Historic specific one. And they don't even mention it in the BNR, right? I think, you know, I was really hoping that they would hit, probably at this point, nerf Elender, so you either don't get the ETB when it's not cast, or maybe nerfing Sorin so that it can only put vampires of a certain mana value into play. But they don't even hit it, and they don't even mention it, right? If it had been a thing where they decided the BNR a few months ago and they've been tracking it and, oh, we've seen Sorin's been popping up, that's, you know, on our radar and we might look at it in the next round of rebalances or something, then that wouldn't be great. I wouldn't be happy with that, but at least it's some kind of acknowledgement. The fact that they don't, you know, Sorin is not mentioned anywhere here when it's been the known best deck for months and absolutely dominated the qualifier, is crazy to me. This line that I've highlighted here, it's kind of laughable in a way. We've been curating the format carefully to make sure no single strategy overwhelms the format. And then Sorin wins 70% of the slots, possibly even more. There are obviously players who don't share their lists on Twitter, just play the events. And, again, Sorin was a known best deck. So there's a chance that there were even more Sorin players than 70% that made it through. And the other thing that is baffling to me, and this is the most concerning thing to me personally, they say, for some time now, we have noticed that creature combo and enchantment strategies have been consistent and dominant in the format, which is just not true. Like, creature combo, I assume they're talking about 4-color Samwise here. Obviously there's a few other creature-based combos. There's Yawgmoth that's within the realm of playability right now, and, I've seen some Kethis occasionally as well. I don't think that's particularly well positioned, but the only two decks that I can really think they're talking about, maybe Devotion as well if they're talking about Team of Battle Crier, but I don't think any of those decks are particularly good right now. Maybe some of them would slot into tier 2 if I was to redo the tier list right now, but I don't think they're particularly good decks right now, so I'm not really sure what they're talking about, and I don't think this is really true either. And then enchantment strategies, the only deck built around enchantments that's even viable right now is Auras, which I assume they're talking about. And if they are talking about 4-color Samwise and Auras, that was the metagame almost a year ago at this point. I went back and looked at the archive of stuff, and it was around September, October time last year where I had a tier list that had Auras and 4-color Samwise as tier 1. So this, to me, the fact they're referencing essentially a metagame from a year ago is a real concern to me. So I think it's been kind of obvious for a little while now that, Historic isn't a massive priority for Wizards, but I think out of any time in recent history, right now is the time where Historic really needs some action against either Sorin or Elenda for the health of the format, which I'm going to be talking about in a little bit. Maybe even more so. I think the last time I felt like this about action needing to happen was back when Tainted Pact got banned, because that deck was so dominant. But even that, 70% when it's the known best deck, maybe this is the most we've ever needed a ban in Historic. And not only is it not even mentioned here, but the only action they've taken, Counterspell being unbanned, basically does nothing in the format, which is what I'm going to come on to next. So Counterspell getting unbanned, I actually like this a lot. I think there's a lot of cards on the ban list in Historic that they should look at again. Lightning Bolt, I think, is a perfectly good, or it would be appropriate power level for Historic right now, and I think it would improve the format a lot. Agent of Treachery, it's baffling that to me is still banned. I've recently actively wanted to play that in a creativity persist deck where you need 8 reanimation targets for consistency, and then you could potentially run Agent of Treachery and Ashen Rider because we don't have that many great non-creatures. We don't have Archon of Cruelty or anything, so the fact, when I actively want to play that in decks at the moment, Agent of Treachery being banned kind of sucks. So I would love them to return and look at the ban list in Historic and just take a few things off that could reinvigorate the format. And I think Counterspell is a good one for sure, but I think it's just too late. I just don't think Counterspell is very good right now because the format is essentially Sorin versus Lurrus. Obviously, Energy is the best Lurrus deck, but for the most part, I think, well, I guess there are other decks as well. Obviously, there's like Eldrazi, there's Lotusfield and stuff, but two of the biggest represented archetypes are Sorin variants and Lurrus variants, right? And Counterspell is just too slow and inefficient against the Lurrus variants because their threats are 1 and 2 mana. If you're on the draw against Auras, it's just too slow, for example. So that side, Counterspell is kind of too slow, I think. And then the other side, the Sorin decks, they main deck sometimes 8 discard spells, which trade really well with Counterspell. Not to mention, I don't think it fits particularly well into any pre-established decks right now. Obviously, there's Jeskai Control, but the mana base trying to get double blue on turn 2 is going to be really rough, and you'd obviously have to get rid of Arena of Glory, which is really important for Flage, and then I wasn't thinking about it, but Andre Strowski on Twitter pointed out that it could also be good in Rona combo, which is one of the other decks that actually made it in the qualifier. So that could be a potential home for it. But again, I think this is basically going to have no effect outside of maybe Rona combo whatsoever. So it's a cool unban, and I think this could have actually had a really big effect if they'd unbanned it and also maybe nerfed Elenda or, nerfed Sorin, because I guess, while we're on the topic, I might as well talk about what I would do if I was going to hit it. And for a while, I did want to just knock a loyalty off Sorin, but the biggest issue for me personally with Sorin is that it's just making brewing so difficult in Historic. The reason why I play Historic the most is because I am a brewer, I am a deck builder. I constantly want to come up with new ideas. And Historic has just been the best place to do that for a really long time. It has a massive card pool, so whenever a new card comes out, there are some alchemy cards or some cool bonus sheet cards that enable interesting combos and interactions. And then, but on the other side, Timeless is obviously the biggest card pool, but the power level of that format is just too high for a lot of new cards to break through. So Historic for me has always felt like the really nice middle ground where the card pool is big and you get to utilize some of these really cool, interesting alchemy cards or bonus sheet cards that aren't in formats like Modern, that make brewing kind of completely new decks really possible and exciting. And right now has been the most difficult time to brew. I think one of the biggest reasons why I haven't been able to pump out many videos recently is just because half my Historic brews I end up just having to ditch because they either can't beat Sorin, they're better with Sorin in them, or I have to build them to hard target Sorin and then I end up losing to the rest of the format. So I think for the health of the format, it just kind of sucks. I feel like there's not really going to be any new decks breaking through until sets come out. And then, like I said, every brew is going to be, can I beat Sorin? If not, ditch it. Is the deck better with Sorin? In which case, it's another Sorin pile added to the format. And if not, if you can hard target Sorin, you're usually going to be bad against Energy and the Lurus deck. So, I don't know. I'm just kind of frustrated about this because all they needed to do really was hit one of the two. And again, I might as well talk about it while I'm on the subject, but I think the best thing to do, I don't know, it's tough because if you hit Sorin, you've either got to take a loyalty off it, which it does reduce the power level for sure, because Sorin dies, which makes it a 3-for-2 rather than a 4-for-2. You don't get to snowball the game as much because you can't give your tokens lifelink to stop generating bigger and bigger tokens every turn. It makes getting Inspiring Cleric worse because you can't use the Lightning Helix mode next turn. So it would be a reduction in power level, but I don't think it would be a big enough reduction that it wouldn't be viable, at which point all the Sorin decks are still the same, but the Sorin part of the deck is just slightly worse. The other part of the deck won't be though. Obviously Orzhov will still have the Overlord plan and Jund will still have Ulamog and Emperor of Bone. So I don't think that would be enough. I think the big issue for me is the lack of deck diversity, because if you remove Sorin from viability, then all of the Sorin variants could possibly be just individual mid-range decks. Then we'd have a variety. We'd have, maybe an Emperor and Ulamog deck. I'm not sure that would be good enough on its own, but, you could have Orzhov, Dollmaker with Overlord, and then you could run other blink effects to utilize your Failure and Dollmaker, or you could run Hate Bear effects that could be targeted or whatever the metagame is, and then you could have the Esper Psychic Frog Diviner Fates deck, and then you could have the Golgari mid-range deck with Shieldred and Necro Dominance. Again, I'm not sure if those decks would be tier 1 without Sorin in them, but the fact that if you take Sorin out, suddenly all the Sorin variants could become 5 completely distinct decks just massively improves the format diversity straight away. And then, newer decks, I've got a whole list of brews that are basically decks to pick up once Sorin is gone from the format. So, yeah, I don't know. I've said it a lot of times, but it's just really frustrating to me that I think out of recent history, at least, this is the time where Historic needed a ban more than anything else. And as long as they just made Sorin or Elenda, unplayable in some way or another, like I said, make Sorin only be able to put mana value 5 or less vampires into play would be a reasonable nerf, I think. Or, you nerf Elenda could be a way to do it, but then you still always have the problem of any powerful vampire makes Sorin good. So yeah, maybe just nerf Sorin, make the cheat ability 5, mana value 5 or less, and the format just opens up. The format just feels so much better again. One final thing that I wanted to say on this as well is that I just don't think the play patterns are particularly fun in matchups between a lot of the top decks right now. I think particularly the Sorin mirrors are kind of miserable because, there is interesting counterplay, especially between sideboarding and play patterns between the different variants as well, but for the most part, it's a Thoughtseize mirror. There's a ton of inbuilt variance into that. A lot of it comes down to who top decks better, which kind of sucks. The Azorius Flash deck is also kind of miserable to play against from a lot of different decks. There's just a lot of the metagame right now that is kind of caused by Sorin existing that makes the play patterns unfun as well. So not only is it unfun play patterns, it's dominating the format, and it's causing, a big lack of deck diversity as well. And all three of those individually should be a discussion for potential action on the ban list. The fact that one deck is basically causing all three is pretty crazy to me. So overall, I guess the point of this unstructured rant is hopefully this message gets across to Wizards. If you feel similarly that Sorin or Elenda kind of needs to be hit for the health of the format, then it would be great to get that on their radar before the next rebalances, because I believe they do rebalances at a separate time to the scheduled BNR. You know, they typically do it, I believe, alongside some of the new Alchemy launches, which I'm not sure when the next one's going to be, actually, because there isn't an Alchemy set for Final Fantasy, I don't believe. So, well, we might be waiting a month or so for the next rebalances anyway. Oh, I guess they've suspended Corey Steelcutter, right? So they should be addressing the nerf to that. So, yeah, if you agree with me about Sorin or Elenda, it would be great to get this message across to Wizards before the next round of rebalances, because right now, I'm still going to be playing Historic for sure. I'm still going to be trying to brew new stuff, but I think I'm probably going to be ditching new ideas that don't work quicker. And if I can't come up with anything new, I might just end up temporarily moving to Alchemy or Timeless until Sorin gets hit, because, like I said, it's just been so hard to brew new decks, and it is because of Sorin, let's be real. So, either way, definitely let me know in the comments what you think about this BNR in general. Let me know how you would nerf either Sorin or Elenda, if, you know, or what you think the best way to do it would be, what you think of the BNR in general, what you think of the Counterspell Unban. Definitely let me know what your thoughts on it. And obviously, you know, a lot has changed in other formats as well. If you're a Standard player, I'd be interested to hear whether Standard is in a good state right now. Maybe I'll move over and try Standard if Historic does remain to be difficult to brew in. But either way, I just had to get this off my chest, and I will be having videos coming up. The reason I didn't put any videos out the past week or so is because a lot of the decks I was working on for the qualifier, other people ended up working on them with me, and we wanted to keep those lists under wraps. But now the format effectively hasn't changed, I'll be posting a bunch of lists that I was working on for the qualifier, a lot of stuff targeted at Sorin, so, you know, maybe we can find out something there. But either way, I just had to get this off my chest. Let me know what you think in the comments, and I'll catch you all in the next one. Big up.